EUDC. So basically, today I'm gonna talk roughly around 1 hour about some analysis meta, something that I noticed that like for some time has been seen as a standard for analyzing claims, responses, extensions, everything in debate. So I'm just gonna basically go over what I think are some positive aspects of it, what are some, I think, flaws, and something that can be used to be, some things you can do to exploit this meta, basically. So firstly, yeah, in terms of what do I mean by this? So by this meta, I mean that basically some standard in analysis became that in order to prove that an actor X will do Y, it is necessary and sufficient to show two things. One is that actor X has incentive to do Y, and secondly, that actor has a capacity to do Y. So as long as these two things are met, often things are seen as proven, or this is seen as some standard, both from speaker perspective, sometimes from judges' perspective, etc. I think teams sometimes struggle to extend on arguments that have like these two areas analyzed, etc. So in this workshop, we'll explore some logical flaws with this reasoning in terms of what are some issues in this kind of logical reasoning. Secondly, show some examples both from real life but also from debates where these things materialize and how they can be exploited, and give you like some very concrete tips in terms of what to think and what to consider in order to basically improve your argumentation, to improve your responses, extensions, and all these things. So the purpose of this workshop is to give you a bit more holistical view of analysis that goes beyond some buzzwords and some things that are just everyone is using in debate, etc., and to show you how to exploit these vulnerabilities, both in terms of proving your own cases, but also from exploiting of your opponent's cases. This is not to the purpose of this workshop is not to abandon analyzing incentives and capacity. This is not to claim that analyzing these two things there is something fundamentally wrong about it. This is not to say that these things don't matter at all, that you should clearly abandon them or like something like that. It is just to show that there are some limits to it and there are some ways how it can be improved. Also, like some of these things, I think maybe don't have much to do with the like ideal takes on incentive plus capacity meta. I think that just some of these takes are just explaining how it materializes in real life, in some realistic debates, how often teams are using this, etc. Okay. So moving on, let's use a trivial example. So as you can see, I use the blurry camera that like blurs my background, which probably means that this slide may or may not have to do with my life currently. So let's say that we want to show that I'm going to clean my room. I can give you 4 structural reasons why I have incentives to keep my room clean. Like it looks better. It helps me with the focus. It's easier for me to find stuff if I'm looking for them. Like everything has its own place. It's healthier. It's more comfortable. It's better to if I have guests. Like family or friends who visit me or something like that. So there's quite a lot of incentives for me to keep my room clean. Moreover, I also have capacity. It's not really that difficult. It doesn't take that much time, especially if you just clean a little bit every day. Like it really is not that big of a deal. I do have enough time to clean it. Cleaning supplies are very cheap. They last forever. You can even use like some kitchen supplies if you're out of, I don't know, some heavy chemistry. You can use like acid, like lemon and like hydrogen soda. Like I'm not sure how it's called in English, but like you really can use things from your kitchen to clean your rooms. It's not really that difficult. Yet, however, the obvious impact of these two things would be that my room is clean, but in reality it is not. It's a mess. I'm using the blurred background just so you don't see like how it looks like. And generally, I think I'm not really the only person that operates like this. I think many people have incentives to keep their room clean or their apartment clean. Many people have capacity to do it, but still many people have very messy, chaotic rooms, dirty rooms, whatever version of this reality might be. So I think on this very trivial example that presumably is not controversial in any way. So you can see that, just because there are incentives and capacity for, some action doesn't mean that this action necessarily is going to happen. Yeah, so here we can see on the left how the world would look like if everyone just acted on their incentives and capacities. On the right, you can see something that's more realistic. It's a room of people who have these incentives and capacity to clean it. So yeah, basically, I think it captures the difference between debate, buzzwords, and jargons, etc., and some real life that we're living in. Okay, so to move to a bit more concrete and like specific, hopefully more useful things. Here, there are 4 premises of the meta that if there are incentives and capacity to do something, that something is going to occur. Again, disclaimer, this is not exhaustive list of all premises of this meta. This is definitely just, these are just definitely some of the premises that exist. Probably there are much more of them. There are some of them that I notice kind of can be exploited, or sometimes teams do not fully analyze them. So what are they? Firstly, the individuals make decisions predominantly based on their interests, or like, there's this incentive part for the individuals. The second one is the same one just for the organizations, like state, companies, etc. Often either one or two is the premise of the argument, but I included organizations separately because I think there are some other aspects of, individuals versus collectives in terms of how decisions are being made. Thirdly is that there are no competing incentives. So basically, the logic is like, okay, you show that there are some incentives to do something else, but like, okay, maybe there will be some other incentives that like are proving the opposite point, etc. So I think this is something that often teams fail to address significantly. And fourthly, I would say having the capacity to do something doesn't, or like the premise is that it implies the ability to perform it. I'm going to go into more details into all of these. If something is unclear, hopefully it's going to get clear with more concrete examples. I think these 4 kind of premises are something that kind of can be exploited both to improve your arguments, but also to respond to your opponent's arguments. So we're going to go chronologically and deal with all of them. So firstly, the premise number 1, individuals act on their interest. I think just if in order to prove that something to happen, we need to prove that the relevant actor is, or stakeholder, or whatever you want to call them, have incentive to do that and capacity to do that. I guess one of the premises is that like people predominantly act based on their, interest, and basically based on their incentives. And I think this is something that in some situation is correct, in some situation is not correct. And I would just like to exploit some of these situations in which it is not correct. So I think firstly, in terms of how people choose whether they're going to act one way or another way, I think there are many things that they are kind of relying on. Some of them are information and this kind of rational thinking, like some strategizing, etc. Some of these things are just, general kind of your emotions and the kind of very short-termistic, not necessarily in terms of the incentives, but just short-termistic in terms of like based on your intuition kind of reaction. There are all books written about it. Not gonna go into these details, but there's some reasons why people often don't act rationally, or like they're not necessarily following their interest. So firstly is firstly the premise of all of that is like that we have some reasonable level of information in order to be able to right. This is the premise that we're going to act according to our interest. Is if we have information, firstly what our interest is, but secondly, more importantly, is whether doing something will actually gets us closer to fulfilling our interest. Here are a few things that just directly kind of challenges whether we have this information. So there are many biases. I just took few of them that I think are interesting that like kind of point out to this people just operate until false or like incomplete information part. So first is availability heuristic, which is just judging the likelihood of an event based off how easily examples come to mind rather than the actual probability. So like if we have some, or like basically we're judging the likelihood of something happening based on the examples that we have access to rather than to all examples, etc. So this might be trivial, but like generally just mean that people often overestimate how much information they have about certain subject, and then the only available information that they have, they believe is much harder portion of the information, and therefore like they believe that they're much more informed about something that they are not. One real life example of this is like news. Often news don't portray you everything that happens. They only portray some things that are sensational, that are important, often negative things, right? Someone died, or like there was car crash, or war in some places, or stuff like that. So like I think that just often then if you just people who watch the news, etc., they believe that the world is much more violent and worse place because the information that they're getting just reflects this basically. But they are unaware that lots of information that they don't have access to simply because it's not covered actually just shows basically the contrary kind of show the opposite the opposite take basically. The second thing here that we got is a confirmation bias. So which is just some bias towards interpretation of information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, while on the other hand ignoring the same amount of information that just contradicts our beliefs. So in more simple words, this means that you are more likely to believe in information that confirms what you already believe, for example, ideologically. So, for example, if you're, let's say, Republican, you're more likely to believe information that you receive from Fox News while putting much higher burden on information receiving from CNN. Simply because the former more aligns with your beliefs rather than the latter. Similarly, if you're a Democrat, US Democrat, you're much less likely to believe anything said in Fox News and probably going to put much higher burdens for any information given there, while on the other hand, you're going to much more likely to take something that is given by your trusted media. Also, like not only like in terms of who is your how do you say source of information, but also like what is the source of information. Like if you're liberal, if these are some liberal ideas or showing that conservatives are doing something negative, you are more likely to believe these ideas. If there is if you're liberal and someone liberal is doing something that you disagree with, you are more likely to think of that it might be over exaggerated or it might be only one situations, etc. Similarly to the conservative people as well. So basically, like we just confirm, like we believe that information that like reflects our bias, our pre-existing beliefs is like we give it much more value, and the one that contradicts it we give much less value. We find some flaws there, we are putting higher bar for that evidence, etc., or simply just ignore it. The third bias that I got here is like actor observer bias. So this is basically the bias where we treat differently ourselves, or even like the actors that we identify with. Sometimes even it can be like the actor in a TV show or like movie if we fully identify with them, or like I don't know, game. But like we often attribute actions of ourselves or of these characters that we identify as we often attribute to their actions to some situational factors, like if I don't know, if we did something crappy, if we I don't know didn't allow for an elderly to sit at our seat in bus, I don't know, we often attribute this to oh, okay, we are very tired, and like I don't know, our legs hurt, there was a leg day yesterday or something like that. So often you just try to find some factors related to this situation, why did something bad, or something like that. And if there is someone else you see that like didn't let elderly sit on their place, you're often being like, okay, they're bad person, like you associate this to their character. rather than, you know, to the situations in which they are operating. Often this has to do with, you know, previous stuff, like mostly availability heuristic, meaning that like you have less information available and you believe that you just see that someone who is young didn't, how do you say, gave opportunity to an elderly person to sit on their place. And you don't even think about, you know, what is their situation, whether they have some accessibilities themselves, whether, you know, they have some reasons for why they didn't do it, but you just, for what you see, you just make the conclusions, etc. Apart from these biases, I would say emotions, I didn't define here. Hopefully everyone is aware in terms of what emotions are. But like, again, something that, you know, often we react more emotionally. And, you know, often these things might mean that we don't act in our best interest. I don't know, I guess anger comes up to my mind as one of these things. Like you become very angry at the situation, and like even though it will be rational and in your best interest to contain this anger and to think of how to approach this, even if you find these people annoying, you still might, you know, be very angry and just overreact, which might long-termly just harm your position. Similar other, like, you know, envy or jealousy, like, you know, it might make sense for you to, you know, cooperate with someone that you are envious of, and but then you know, simply because of this emotion you are not cooperating with them or something like that. So like you can think of many of these emotions. What also makes this harder is just if you are prone to, you know, many defense mechanisms, one of them being rationalization, where we can basically explain to us, even if we are aware of all these things, we can explain to us that, you know, oh, but this is not really, you know, I was actually considering all the evidence. I'm aware of confirmation bias, but I was actually considering, you know, even after this consideration, I still believe to this news more rather than some others, etc. So like, I think generally just what I'm trying to prove here. Obviously, there are much more biases. Again, there are books written about it. There is quite a lot of literature. There is critique on this literature. So like really, someone who is much more expert on this topic, or like who was any expert on this topic rather than me, could talk about this probably for 2 hours and like still have things to say afterwards. But I just want to give you some things that I think can be useful in debates, and sort of some things showing to you that generally we don't act based upon our incentives, rather we act based on, you know, biases, emotions, you know, all of these other factors. Sometimes we act also on incentives, but also on many other things, which means that one of the first premises of, you know, reasoning, that for something to happen we need to have relevant stakeholder having incentive for that to happen, but also capacity to do. If inherently it is unclear whether actor acts with how do you say, incentives as the predominant like driver, it seems to be that like there might be already some issues in reasoning. Again, there are many situations when people do act based on their incentives, and based on their interest, following their like maximization of their interest. But there are many situations in which they don't. I think it's much better to ask yourself how people make decisions in this specific situation that was, you know, constructed by this motion, like something to do debating, rather than just, you know, to assume that, you know, people just act in maximizing their incentives, and therefore, like, if you show that, you know, they have incentive to do that, they're gonna do that. Some other stuff that also like can kind of harm our ability to do things based like that are in our interest. Maybe certain social pressures, you know, if you're different genders, like there are different social expectations of what you are supposed to do and you're not supposed to do. You might be judged for doing something that might be in your interest or not. For, you know, if you're being I don't know, like if you're older, like sibling, like rather than younger, there are different expectations. Like there are many different things that we have a little control over that kind of pushes us into behaving in a certain ways that might or might not be in our best interest. So again, the purpose of this like slide and something to understand is like, look, there are lots of reasons in which people do not act in their best interest, and therefore just proving that they have incentive to do something is not sufficient unless we explain that actually they are likely to, you know, follow these incentives in these specific situations. Okay, and here you see some of the things that can be used in order to kind of challenge some of these analyses, etc. happening. I have maybe a bit more straightforward example. in terms of how people vote. Again, something like that I think comes in debate from time to time, like people voting, and like there's this argument like when people vote, people have incentive to inform themselves about different candidates or just evaluate their policies, given that these policies have lots of influence on them. They'll like basically influence how they're gonna live for the next electoral term or like period, how it's called. Like lots of these things like gonna influence them, like what is allowed, what is like illegal or illegal. I don't know who they can marry, how much taxes are gonna pay, whether their country is gonna be close to one or the other foreign power, how it's going to influence them. Some country might impose sanctions on you because the foreign policy of your government. So like there's quite a lot of incentives for people would be that people have to inform themselves about any types of elections. And like again, there are lots of reasons why people have capacity to inform themselves. Political parties are talking about this, debating these issues. These issues are not just made up for the electoral cycles. They just exist. There's some important issues about your everyday life or like about your state all the time. So you should be able to be aware of this. They are discussed not only in like political campaigns on TV and social media, but also like in like regular life, like at work and school, etc. So like, okay, there's a couple of reasons why people have incentive to inform themselves who they should vote and like to choose the best candidates is going to have the best policies. While on the other hand, there's many reasons why people have a capacity to inform themselves. So according to this logic, people would make good decisions or vote for the candidates that will actually have the best policies, etc. I think realistically what happens in is a bit more complicated than this. Firstly, most of the elections are decided on one or two like major issues, and other policies are much less relevant in deciding who's gonna vote for or not. So, for example, the last U.S. Presidential election, I would say lots of it comes to few questions. One is simply ideological, like are you in favor of like more woke policies versus more conservative like ideologies? Kind of, I think really just not even on the level of policy, but simply on the level of identity. Like, what do you think is the way how our society should look like, right? The second thing probably would be migration, right? Whether you are for more or less strict migration laws. I would say lastly, it has something to do with the econ, but still, like I think for many of these things, it was not the major things in terms of the voters voting. But yeah, I think in some of the instances, at least in some swing states, probably it was also one of the reasons. And many of other stuff and some specific stuff, probably they are kind of relevant, but are not something that's gonna make people decide. People are not making Excel sheets and saying, this candidate gets 5 points for immigration, but like -2 for taxes, and then like they have 3 points, and then the other candidate gets, I don't know, 1 and 1, so this candidate wins. No, they pick what is important for them, something often that is either about identity or one or two policies, and then these things are the reasons why they vote for this candidate rather than the other ones. But also, it's not only in terms of the policies, it's also like what biases they have toward the candidates. If they are brought in conservative family, and if generally their parents voted more Republicans, they're much more likely to vote Republicans and to vote for conservatives. Similarly with Democrats and liberal policies, etc. Lots of these things kind of influences how you vote. Your community as well, if you're in some liberal cities, like more likely you're gonna vote for Democrats, you're gonna be much bigger expectations from you, lots of your environment already votes, etc. Also, like the bias towards information, we already talked about the confirmation bias, about which media you trust, which elements from these media you actually trust more, or like trust less, etc. Which one you disregard. All of these things mean that for many of these instances, candidates do not, people don't actually inform themselves that much. Rather, they overestimate how much they informed. They put different burdens on like different ideologies, and often vote for candidates based on they are already pre-existing beliefs. I mean, you can even ask yourself for yourself, like in many of these instances, how often you come really without very strong feelings about the candidates before you hear about their policies and about their agenda. I guess, somewhat you are like amenable to, persuade. I don't think no one is fully persuaded. Obviously, there are elections that go one way or another. You have swing voters who maybe don't have that strong opinions, that are minority or like in some minority situations, but still they exist. Also, secondly, the question is whether all of the people who are necessarily naturally supporting one or the other ideologies are gonna go and vote, right? Whether they will actually they can still simply not vote and abstain from voting. So like this can also influence the elections. Also, like some major scandals, some big, really big things, paradigm shifts, etc., can also influence whether people are voting or not. So like it's not that nothing is influencing. It's just that like even though we have a full and the best incentives and capacity to inform ourselves and to vote for the best candidate, that still we are often voting based on many other things that are, maybe not in our best interest, but simply in terms of how do we feel, what are we vibing with, etc. Okay, I would just like to give a few disclaimers on these two previous slides. I guess firstly, I think it's perfectly fair to defend in debate, for example, that people are fine in voting based on their kind of gut feeling, etc., and that maybe it even makes sense. I think it's fair to argue that this is something that probably is perfectly sensible or even rational, or like it makes sense. So like I'm not giving you the definitive answer in terms of how you should approach voting debates. I'm just giving you some in my opinion, argument that happens from time to time, but I think it's relatively simplistic and often doesn't just capture the scale that it's trying to capture. I think you can use this reasoning to improve your argument in terms of thinking, okay, what actually people are going to inform themselves? What are these groups? Are these some people who are swing voters? Why do they matter? Something like that. Like you can contextualize better your arguments and improve them so they are less vulnerable to response. Or if you face some simplistic argumentation as given here, you're going to be able to challenge that more effectively. So just again, like the first disclaimer is like, okay, I'm not giving you answer to this argument, or like just I'm not reading this argument, like giving a critique on this argument as it's in itself. I'm just giving you some, I think, general ways to basically respond to these kind of arguments. The second thing is, if you're very carefully following, you can think of, yeah, but like I'm giving you some biases and some, how do you say, some reasons why people might not have capacity to act rationally, but this might be just proving the capacity part of individuals incentives plus capacity kind of in that framework. I guess it's technically true, but I think if we are showing you here that there are some aspects, that means that inherently you're unable to follow your incentives. This can be just kind of way to think about it. But yeah, I mean, you can still say that technically this is just showing that there is no capacity because you're not capable of seeking information in a way that we avoid confirmation bias, or that we avoid all of these kind of biases, emotional reactions and stuff like that. Again, I think like the biggest tip here should be like you should think of more how people make these decisions, specifically in the motion in the context like given by the motion, rather than just thinking of, okay, what is the interest of the sector. Here are three things that's why this is in their interest, and like, okay, here's two reasons or whatever why they'll do it, and then this thing is proven. Okay. So premise number 2, which maybe it should be better if it was like 1B, but it's like the premise is like the collectives act on predominantly based on their interest. So like by collectives, like meaning some organizations, it can be states, companies, NGOs, like anything that's just a bit more complex than individuals, like even families. You can maybe analyze in this context, etc. And I think that there are a couple of things that can make this explanation tricky. I think the biggest one is that like these collectives, I mean, all of these previous things like information asymmetry, different biases, emotions. This can also exist for, people who are employed or who are part of these organizations. But I think just the unique things for the collectives, and why I make it as a disjoint point, is that these organizations are complex entities that comprise of lots of different individuals or institutions or positions, etc., that all together mutually interact. And the thing is that they might have different level of information from one another, or for example, CEO can have different information than, I don't know, shareholders. They might have different interests. And therefore, I think this is something that makes analyzing these scenarios, I think, interesting, because I think often what happens is that teams just trivialize what the incentive of these big collectives are, and then without considering that they comprise of many parts that themselves might have different incentives. And I think that one thing that you should think of is think of structure of these organizations, how they're what they are made of, how these different structures interact, etc. So, for example, companies, they're not just shareholders; it's also CEO, board of directors, employees, even company as a just some general kind of abstract entity that has a certain own reputation, or just generally branding. I think we say is probably part of this complex of this abstract entity of the company. Similarly, the state is not just the government, or different branches of government, but also interest group lobbyists, rich people, voters, different classes, or these people, minorities that might exist here, etc. Even for some dictatorship, which people sometimes trivialize in debating, there's lots of inner structure. You have, besides of the dictators and very close people around him, you often have different party members, lower ranking bureaucrats, security apparatus that consists of military, secret services, oligarchs, or rich, generally, businessmen, all of these things. And all these groups interact together, and they don't necessarily have same, how do you say, incentive, right? For example, you can say that, I don't know, dictator might be okay on having a sanctions on that country, because this might make voters generally despise the country that is imposing sanctions on them, and this might actually give him upper hand in how do you say, improve his approval rating. On the other hand, you can say that oligarchs maybe don't like it because it just harms their ability to earn money and frees loss of their assets. It don't allow them to operate in many outside of their country, or outside of very few countries. So you can say that one thing can have different repercussions, or at least in different level of intensity on different groups within these things. So I think again, the biggest tip here should be just to consider the structure of these organizations and how decisions are made and what the different interests are. And I think there is quite a lot of issues that might occur, given that all this complexity of these collectives. Some of them are given here. We're going to go into a bit more details in the following slides. So firstly, the principal agent problem. So this is a conflict of interest that arises when one person or group, it's called the agent, is tasked with acting on behalf of another person or group. It's called the principal. And the reason is basically very simple, that sometimes incentives are not perfectly aligned, and what is often the case is the agent has more information about their own action than the principal. It doesn't have to be all the time, but often it is the case. Few examples here. So one is the CEO, which might prioritize the short-term profits or personal bonus rather than long-term health of the company, and the company, on behalf of which it is acting, is seen as a principal. Again, the politician, they, often care about themselves, their popularity, re-election, power, etc., rather than necessarily that might not necessarily be in the interest of the citizens. Third one might be soldiers in the state. So in some war context, etc., soldiers might prioritize their own safety or like generally strategic or some general strategic objectives, or like state security, etc. Again, not all the time, but sometimes these things can misalign. So there are a couple of instances in which this problem can occur when you have these complex organizations that different parts of it, due to the information asymmetry and different interests, that they have just different kind of incentives that exist here. Meaning that often, obviously, even if rationally it would make sense for a business or for a state to act in their interest, it is not always clear, firstly, what this interest is, but secondly, also whether those who are making the decision actually have the same interests that are aligned with this. So rather than just analyzing incentives of these abstract entities, it is also important to analyze the incentives of those individuals or groups or structures that are making these decisions. Okay. I have here a little bit on the like states and rationality, like specifically. Often it is true that they're rational, but like if you're thinking about, for example, US involvement in two longest wars, one was in Afghanistan that lasted for 20 years, another is Vietnam. So it lasted 18 years, their involvement. Not all the time it was like the direct military, not all the time it was boots on the ground, like it was some military advisors for some time of it, but like still it was a very long war. Like in both of these instances, like US lost, right? In Afghanistan we still have Taliban's, and like now everyone is ignoring this awkward thing that there was a very bloody and expensive war in Afghanistan where lots of people died for like 20 years, that basically now has the same group in government that it was supposed to defeat. In Vietnam, we also know that North won the civil war, and that basically US lost, even though it was overly like overpowered compared to their, like, at least in terms of military technology, resources and stuff like this. And why does this happen? Why does it happen that a relatively sophisticated, rich country that is democracy, I mean, probably flawed democracy, but still a democracy, is able to go into these things and like fail like these wars, lose quite a lot of lives, both their their own citizens, but also crimes against the local population that exist in these situations. Lots of resources, lots of money, lots of harms, in these instances. I guess one thing might be, again, the information, like, again, the premise of that the states specifically are acting rationally based on their incentives is that they have information, what their incentives are, but also what they should do in order to maximize these goals. Intelligence often can be distorted simply because it can be lost in all of these bureaucracy, who is giving information to whom, whether some of these bureaucrats sometimes have interest to conceal some of this information and stuff like that. Also, like, one, I think, interesting point about states and just generally intelligence is that oftentimes, this is specifically true in the West, and like specifically in the US, is that the intelligence is received by people who are defectors from these countries. So for example, lots of times these people are the only ones who speak, or like, it's very difficult to find many people who speak the language, who understand the customs, etc. So you would have people who basically are in exile from these countries, giving you not necessarily intelligence, but generally working on these reports, etc. Often these people are biased for obvious reasons against these countries. Sometimes this information is still correct, even though they're biased. They often have good reasons to be biased, right? But sometimes it can be distorted, and then you simply intelligence you see is not great. Sometimes advisors will tell leaders what they want to hear rather than what's true. Lots of people are speculating that I think it's very fair to take it. Russia's attacks, war in Ukraine, like direct involvement, like without doubt, that started in 2022, is something that was probably miscalculated, that they didn't expect it's going to last this long. They expected that they're going to be able to capture Kiev very soon. Like some attacks on Kiev, like initial one indicated that they might have been expecting they will be able to capture this. One explanation for why this might happen is like that, advisor was just telling, Putin things that he wanted to hear rather than what is true, or just couldn't be fully honest in terms of these scales, etc., because they might be, they might be afraid for themselves. They want to, I don't know, just don't go into conflict with these advisors. Generally, like optimism bias, just thinking that war will last shorter, etc. Lots of these things you'll see, like afterwards, politicians just think that wars will last shorter, etc. But also, like, the thing is, like, often when these wars start, or like generally, when these things start, that like there are issues that first leaders don't want to pull out, even if they see that they cannot able to win, because they themselves will have to kind of be someone who pulled out and will have legacy kind of harmed by losing the war. It can harm their popularity. Also, like there is just aversion towards this loss. Also, like the sunk cost fallacy, like we already spent quite a lot of money, and if we didn't achieve anything, it's always in vain. So let's try to do something else, etc. Meaning that often these wars become longer than even if it becomes relatively obvious it's going to do. Different political repercussions that might exist for that specific party and stuff like that. Also, like different lobbies that also might influence this, like, is again something that might do. So, like, obviously, like, even though the states probably often act in their own best interest, there are lots of situations where either because of incomplete information or just generally for some pernicious political incentives that go not hand in hand with what states are doing, they might stay in war longer, which might have serious repercussions for these states. So, like, simply because they don't want to basically accept defeat and stuff like that. Here again, we have example from maybe a round, which is like this: how the U.S. Should intervene in Yemen. So again, we have U.S. has incentive to have a good intervention without committing war crimes. Why? Because they'll be helping allies. They will be defeating like rogue actors, securing shipping lanes. We know that Yemen is close to different straits that are very important. Reputation, like, of them as a country, they really care about their reputation, whatever. And then, like, they have capacity, they have the best intelligence, the best weapons, most of money. Yemen is relatively good terrain for like for warfare. Like, they're trained on these kind of training, like lots of wars in the Middle East and stuff like that. So apparently, you can say that this means that the war will be how do you say effective, and that these things will that US will be successful in establishing some humanitarian like standards in Yemen, but while also securing like their own interests. The issue is like I would say with this reasoning is like, one thing is like who makes the decision. Like, there is lots of actors. So one here, I think, there are soldiers on the ground. Oftentimes this was at least big thing in Vietnam, that like soldiers couldn't really discriminate between North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese soldiers, or like their allies, and like or like even supporters, like random civilians, whether they are more aligned with North or South Vietnamese. They didn't understand all these contexts, etc., which meant that in many of these instances they were afraid that they were basically committing quite a lot of war crimes out of fear about not knowing who these actors are. Lots of brutality happened as a consequence of this. So like, obviously, I think one thing here that I think this argument that has incentive and capacity part is that like it just relies that someone who makes the decision has the control on someone who actually is going to have a much more direct engagement there on the ground. Again, the question is, what does it mean to win the war? Sort of like how like okay, maybe you're going to defeat presumably Houthi militias, but still like what happens after this defeat? When does it end? Like, do you impose some kind of I don't know, puppet government, etc.? Whether you're actually good in this, whether you actually do have a capacity for this, etc. So again, this argument can see it have incentive and capacity, and I think it's a fair argument. I think it's fair to run this in a round. I don't think this is like horrible, and like if you run this, you don't know how to debate. Like, this is definitely there are some reasons given here, but we just want to think of what could be some logical things that might be the issues with this kind of reasoning, how to be able to exploit it. Okay, so the next about companies and rationality, just very briefly, it's similar idea. Often there will be these arguments, company wants to like it has incentive to maximize profit, and they have knowledge how to do it, blah blah blah. They're in their markets, experts, etc., etc. Therefore, they will maximize profit. Again, I think generally this makes sense as a logic, but I think still there might be some ifs and buts. One is again a principal agent problem between for example, CEO and shareholders, but like different parts within the company. It can be caused by information asymmetry because the CEO often knows more than shareholders, and like generally if they have different incentives, they might basically it might not necessarily lead to maximization of profit. It can be also corruption and nepotism. Often, we just assume that these companies are very rational. Everything is, kind of works well, etc. Often this is not the case. It really helps who do you know. There is lots of push for, people who are, I don't know, on power to, I don't know, employ people who are, close to them, like on some lower positions, which, with some time creates kind of these structures that are not necessarily, meritocratic. Also, just generally, cooperations between different companies might not be rooted in profitability, but generally just nepotism. Who knows who? Stuff like that. Also, coordination problem. Like everything kind of assumes that you're gonna have synchronized action between different branches in the company, which often might not be the case because they might have the opposing kind of incentives, etc., which might create, lots of these inefficiencies in terms of the company's business activities, to say. So again, like even on this example, we see, that big organizations, including companies, not only state, are not always going towards maximizing their goals or like their interests. Some other misalignments between individual and collective. One is collective action problem. Another like prisoner's dilemma in terms of difference between what's individually and like collectively rational. One example for that is the arms race. So like it might be more sensible both from, let's say, Russia and NATO not to invest quite a lot of money into military and army and weapons and stuff like that. But the issue is that, for example, Russia knows that if they stop doing it and NATO does it, they're going to be much stronger than them, and vice versa. And therefore, like, even though for both of them, it will make sense to just have much less investment into these things. Due to this, fundamental mistrust, they kind of have incentive to actually both invest. And what actually is happening, both of them do invest. So like, yeah, I would say here, just I don't think these two things exploit any kind of fallacies in the reasoning. I just, in terms of the collective, I just think they show kind of some differences in terms of how collective versus individuals might see different things rational. The second thing also works for individuals as well. But due to arms race example, I put it here on this slide. Okay, moving on to the third premise, which is that there are no competing incentives. So just to recap, like we said, for something to happen, the meta is to show that X has incentive to do Y, and also X has capacity to do Y. But I think what often happens is that things overlook whether, even if there is incentive to do for X to do Y, if there are some other incentives, either for X to do something else or just simply not to do Y, right? And I think this kind of tunnel visioning often just allows for some vulnerabilities in terms of dealing with this. And some things just here, I think firstly, there is always opportunity cost. So like, no matter what, if I'm doing something, what is opportunity cost? Basically is the value of the next best alternative that you give up when you make a decision, or probably it will be, I would say, difference between the value of the next best alternative versus the one thing that you're doing. But yeah, anyway, the point is that whatever I'm doing right now, I could have been doing something else. And the details could also give me some value. So for example, I know I'm giving now this workshop. I could have been, I don't know, chilling or working or whatever. So like there is some opportunity cost in this section. And similarly to, any kind of, incentive of any stakeholder, like if individual is taking time to educate themselves about voters' policies, they could have used this time to, I don't know, chill after work or like, I don't know, feed their kids or whatever. So there is opportunity cost. If a state is investing in military, there is opportunity cost because they could have been investing in, I don't know, education or healthcare or something like that. So there is always the opportunity cost. There is always something else that you could have been doing. And I think like often what is overlooked in things is that I think this is not analyzed. It's not understood that, okay, there might be some reasons why you would be investing here, but like why on some counterfactuals you wouldn't invest on something that you might also be incentivized to do, right? Some specific aspects in which that often manifests is like short versus long-term actions. Often, you have some incentives in short term to do something and some other incentives to do something else in the long term. And how different actors are, how do you say, basically balancing these things is not often clear. And often debate is there, right? It's not something that this is what we're debating. So something you should be aware of. Moreover, I think sometimes it's just different, values, or like it's difficult to compare on some very specific criteria. Like either, this action will lead to this value, some other action that you also have that might have do instead of this might lead to some other values. Maybe you have interest in both of these values, but the thing is which one is more relevant, more comparative, more proximate to you, it is unclear often. It might be even some principle versus some, utility. Many things can be here compared. So again, I think something that like often teams will just give some reasons why there is incentive to do that, but they wouldn't necessarily analyze why there are no incentives to do the opposite thing, or why these incentives are stronger than the incentives to do the opposite things, and something like that. So basically, the tip here is just to try to holistically evaluate how different incentives matter to an actor. Like it's not only to show that there is incentive to do something like that, but also that there are more incentives to do that than the opposite things. This might seem tautological or obvious or like whatever, fair enough, but I think I noticed in many of these instances that teams miss on this analysis, and therefore their argumentation kind of become more simplistic. So here for competing incentives, we have like the example of government and their incentives, like government like of the state. So for example, government has incentive to stabilize the economy in short term, but also in the long term, right? And also they have like incentives to not piss off the voters in the short term because they want to be re-elected. But if they screw up too much economy, they're gonna piss off the voters probably because the economy will be screwed. So still, they're not gonna be re-elected. So often, in terms of the economic policies, they have to kind of balance between the short and long-term interests. And often the debate is here, right? Many of these things, I think, debate becomes around these things. One thing, a few examples going here. One thing is austerity, where in the short term, austerity is often seen as negative thing because people are losing their jobs. You cut spending. You can even say that you cut the economic activities because there is less spending and like less money circulating in economies, etc. But on the other hand, in the long run, you stabilize economy. You you don't increase your debt, like you minimize inflation. So like you can say that in the long run, it stabilizes economy. In the short term, it pisses off the voters. And then, it's a balance in terms of, whether what governments are more likely to do. because still it's not in their interest to just disregard the economic downturn, because eventually they might be blamed for that, right? And it might be too late to be able to deal with this. They might harm their activities, economic activities, stuff like that. Similarly, like increasing / decreasing interest rates. Like obviously, if you decrease interest rate, this means that you are incentivizing economic activity, that loans become cheaper, etc. But it's also like in the long run probably boost inflation, and it has some other repercussions. Like I don't want to go into too much details, but on the other hand, if you increase interest rate, it just becomes very expensive for someone who has a loan, who has loan with a flexible like interest. Mortgage can be very expensive, etc. So like it's really like how do you balance these different incentives? You have incentive not to piss off these people who are renting right now, versus you also don't have incentive to piss off people who want to invest their money. So again, it's kind of a balance. Similar with the government spending, like sure, like you don't want to cut the government spending because people will be pissed off, specifically like I don't know, elderly, like pensioners, people on welfare, stuff like that, right? Or generally, like most of the people like will be pissed off. But still, if you don't decrease spending, sometimes just you're gonna run deficit. It's gonna be very very expensive for you to acquire more debt. It's gonna create lots of issues in the long run, and it's just governments need to kind of make like there are competing incentives for completely opposite things, right? For austerity versus against austerity, for increasing versus decreasing interest rates, decreasing government spending. So there are incentives for opposing things. So often what teams I think are missing is to analyze the comparity here. They will show that there are incentives to do this, but they won't necessarily analyze why these incentives are more relevant than incentives for the counterfactual, if it makes sense. Rather than these opposing incentives, there are also like different groups that you are kind of loyal to, like different voter groups, like different or simply voter groups versus lobbyists, right? People who have money, like because often very rich people who garner quite a lot of money have some opposing interests as some middle class or poor individuals, but then you kind of rely on both. So like who do you prioritize in which instances, etc. I would say in lots of these things there is no clear answer. I would say that like this is debate. This is what this discipline is about, this hobby is about, whatever you want to call it. But just be aware that there are like this is not necessarily just logically to prove that there are incentives that something will for an actor to do something without comparing it to the incentives to do the opposite thing or some other things, right? So just be aware of that, and I think like already your organization will get better. Last thing in terms of the premises here that we got is premise that capacity is equals to capability. So I'm ESL, so really excuse me if these terms are not properly defined, but I did my power with ChatGPT and Google to try to have these definitions. So by capacity, what I mean for the purpose of this workshop is just the maximum amount of extent of something or someone can produce, handle, like basically the limit, like your maximum. Capability is your ability to perform, like basically the competence what you're gonna do. So like maybe my capacity is, I don't know, to be fully ripped and to be rich and to be the best speaker in the world, etc. Like if I really min-maxed everything in my life, or maybe my capability, my realistic thing is like not gonna do all these things, or just even most of them, right? So like these two things I think are different, and I think that I think it makes more sense to analyze the latter, your capability. But I noticed that sometimes often teams are analyzing the former, which is capacity, which is some theoretical possibility that you can do that, right? Without realistical reasons why you will do this. So people don't operate under their maximum capacities, and you should be aware of this. We already saw one example with this, which was wait, we saw a few examples with this. One was with wait, yeah, the US and Yemen. So like there's capacity, which by capacity here, this like intelligence, best weapons, most money, good terrain, great, right? But it doesn't mean that, they'll be capable realistically of using these things in a way that they will actually win the war, right? It's just giving a list of things that shows that, US could be able to win it, but not that they are likely to be able to win it. The second example that I actually have for here is here, the regulation. I think, again, something that often I saw. So, for example, state has incentive to regulate banks. So, I don't know, banks are critical for economy, failures or recessions, etc. Happen if banks go down, especially if we're too big to fail. Voters care about these things. So, like, presumably state has incentive to regulate these banks. On the other hand, state has capacity because, I don't know, they have all of these experts who can actually get all of these information and data. They access to bank records, to different risk models. They monitor everything, like lots of smart guys with quite a lot of Excel and the ability to impose, fines, to have laws, to inspect the banks, etc. And like, okay, here we provide some 3 reasons why states have incentive to regulate bank and 3 reasons why states have capacity to regulate banks. But again, these things don't show that state is actually capable, rather that like state in theory could regulate them, right? Firstly, like I think what is not answered is like premise number 3, like whether there are competing incentives while these things might not be regulated. So like even if state has incentive to regulate banks, whether there are some other incentives not to regulate them. I think often it is called in terms of, okay, banks are related to donors, like they're very powerful individuals. Deregulated sectors benefit many people who are giving quite a lot of money to states. So like maybe there are competing reasons to not regulate banks. So I think this is one reason that might be, I think that might be problematic with this. The second might be simply the regulatory captures. Like even state is capable of doing all these things that are written here. It is unsure that realistically this is how world look like. I.e., it is unsure how the regulatory bodies actually operate and whether they are doing their maximum into the things that are said here, whether they are really independent from, power of very powerful individuals in financial sectors, whether they are likely to try to work there in the future, because often, financial private sector offers you much more money than regulations, right? Whether they know these people, they're close to them, stuff like that. So whether actually this regulation is likely to happen. So like, again, the thing is like, I think in theory, state has a capacity to regulate them, but the thing is whether practically this capacity is reached, right? Whether realistically this capacity or some reasonable level of this capacity is reached. Simply if they're capable of doing that. So yeah, I think hopefully this semantical differences here is clear. But what is important to understand is that often the ways how teams are describing capacity is just giving you how in best case scenario state is capable of regulating, or someone is capable of doing anything, etc., without giving you realistically why this capability exists, or in some realistic scenarios. So just be aware that how to be able to deal with this, like so you can respond to it, so you know that something is missing, so maybe can try to extend that and stuff like that. Again, disclaimer here as well, I'm not saying that having this argument, like with these first two things, means that it's a bad argument, that I'm not gonna buy it if you run it, or like that you shouldn't run it, or like it's bad debating or anything. I think it's reasonable. I think I saw some good rounds where these kind of arguments won. I just think that they have some vulnerabilities that you should try to exploit. I think here the vulnerability is that just capacity is explained as some abstract kind of maximum of what state could theoretically be doing, rather than what they are likely going to be doing. All right. Okay, so some questions that you can ask yourself in order to improve on these things, and then there are some questions you can ask me if you want. So firstly is, what are inherent features of the actors besides their incentives and capacity? So again, in this meta, we are thinking of incentives and capacity of the actor, but are there some other inherent feature of them that are not necessarily just their incentives and capacity? What do I mean by inherent features? These are some things that are not possible to separate from these actors. You simply describe them like this, right? Similar like parents care about their kids, probably like inherent features of parents. Again, you could probably say it's incentive, but like you could probably have other, how they say inherent features, which is maybe that parents fear for their kids, or that they have fear that they might not be good parents, and therefore they're gonna try to they I don't know, carry the burden of their personal traumas and like how their parents were like with them and stuff like that. So like I think like inherent feature is something that you cannot separate from these actors. This is not necessarily only incentives and capacity, but also the other things. The second thing is like who is the actor and how they're making the decision. How different like biases, values, information, etc. are influencing in them making this decision. Similarly to the collective organization. So like who makes the decision in a corporation, in state, etc. Again, for specific things that are debated, like impossible to say on the abstract, like how these groups operate, how for these specific things they'll be operating, etc. I think something again that will improve your debating. Fourthly is, are there any conflicting incentives for actions of this actor? So like again, if there are, so why your incentives are relevant than the conflicting or opposing incentives. Fifthly is just because there is capacity, is there a capability to do it? Again, like basically the idea is like it's not just some abstract maximum of what the actor could do, but rather to realistically what they will do. And lastly, is just simply the question is like, am I describing the defensible version of a real world? I don't want to say like the real world, because what the real world is, like, I think is debatable. It's part of the debate, like how the real world looks like. But like, is this something defensible? Is this something too simplistic? Is this something that makes sense? Has some. I'm not sure how. Like, just is this sensible? Is this like? Could I explain this to someone who is not debater? So it in a non-debating context, and would it make sense? I mean, sometimes obviously there are very, I don't know, philosophical, etc. arguments. You might think, oh, but I can never explain this to someone who is maybe not a debater, not academic, something like that. But like in most of the instances where we are debating real world things, like just random policy issues, econ issues, etc., just think of yourself, okay, is this thing that I could explain to someone who is not looking at Max and what average informed voter is saying or whatever, but rather like without buzzwords, something that I could explain to a random dude that has nothing to do with debate. And obviously read more about the world in order to be able to have this gut check for you. I think these are some of the questions that kind of you can use. Again, the purpose was not here to just say that you should not analyze incentives and capacity, nor that this invalidates this reasoning at all, but just generally, this is, how do you say, some things that I think you can use to improve your argumentation or responses on these things. All right, thanks for listening. Now, if there are any questions, feel free to ask.